Good day. Today is Thursday, 13th March 2025, and there is a reasonable chance, indeed a good prospect, that, like several of my videos, by the time it is published, events will have moved on, and you will know more about current affairs as you watch this video, or at least about the latest news by the time you watch this video, than I do at the time of its making. There are all sorts of reports circulating that Stephen Witkoff is now in Russia. Apparently people have been tracking the movement of his aircraft, and it crossed into Russian airspace some time ago, and it's quite plausible that he's now in Moscow. Anyway, Steve Witkoff is either heading to Russia or is probably in Russia. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has spoken about the possibility that Putin may take international calls over the course of today, and it's not unlikely, if such a call does take place, that it will be a call between himself and Donald Trump. And, well, there are also reports which we need to take very, very carefully in the media in the West, in Reuters, in the Daily Telegraph, in other places, about communications between Moscow and Washington. There's also a report that I've seen about a telephone conversation that supposedly has taken place between Vladimir Putin's national security advisor, Sergei Shoigu, and some senior official from the United States. It could be Mike Waltz, who is Donald Trump's national security advisor. I think if this telephone conversation did take place, it almost certainly was with Mike Waltz, by the way. Waltz said directly after the meeting with the Ukrainians on Tuesday that he expected to speak to his opposite numbers in Moscow within the next few days. So it's logical that he would have spoken to Putin's national security advisor, who is, of course, Shoigu. But anyway, reports of that call, other reports, by the way, I've seen, say it was actually Witkoff, who is not, as far as I can see, properly speaking, an official of the American government at all, just saying. He is a private individual who appears to be carrying out certain diplomatic functions on behalf of his friend, the President of the United States, rather like Harry Hopkins, by the way, who was a friend of President Roosevelt's during the Second World War, also carried out various diplomatic missions on behalf of the President, Franklin Roosevelt, during the Second World War. But anyway, there's reports that this telephone conversation has taken place. I've seen no confirmation of that from the Russian side. Quite likely there has been such a conversation. Quite likely Putin and Trump will speak today. Almost certainly Witkoff is indeed in Moscow, and he's going to meet senior Russian officials. There's lots of speculation as to what response there will be from the Russians to the 30-day ceasefire offer that the Americans, and I stress this is the Americans, made on Tuesday. The joint statement released by the Americans and the Ukrainians make quite clear that this was an American proposal for a 30-day ceasefire, which the Ukrainians accepted, and the Americans appear to be, well, are making the same proposal to the Russians. Anyway, lots of speculation about how the Russians are going to respond to that offer. Reuters is claiming that the Russians have said that though they're not hostile to the idea of a ceasefire, they do attach conditions to it. This is all based on comments from Western officials. We don't know which Western officials. We don't know how Reuters has obtained this information. But supposedly, these proposals, these counter-proposals that the Russians are making are in line with things that the Russians have said in the past. And you can find reflections of this report from Reuters in various sections of the media, including, by the way, in the Daily Telegraph in Britain. Having read the Reuters report and having read the Daily Telegraph report, it seems to me that there probably has been some communication between the Americans and the Russians since Tuesday, and that the Russians have simply said that, yes, they are prepared to accept a ceasefire, but on the basis of the proposals made by Putin in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry back in June 2024. In other words, the Russians are still insisting that the Ukrainians must withdraw their forces from the four regions, from Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. Anyway, that's the rumours. What about the facts? Well, we have now had two important clues about where events are going. Firstly, the Russian presidential aide, Yuri Ushakov, has now provided an interview to Russian television. Now, Ushakov is a very senior official in Russia. He is a close aide of Putin's, a close foreign policy aide of Putin's. He was one of the team that went to Saudi Arabia with Lavrov and who met with and spoke to Rubio, Waltz and Witkoff. And I'm reasonably sure that he is saying what he's saying in this interview represents the official Russian position. Though, to stress again, he's only an aide to Putin. We will have to wait for the top officials, for Putin or Lavrov, to make clear what the Russian position currently is. Anyway, this is the report I've read about the Ushakov interview. I've not yet found a report about it on TASS, the official Russian news agency, though no doubt one will come. But there is a full report in, of all places, the Daily Telegraph, and I will read it out. A ceasefire with Ukraine would simply give their military time to rest and rearm, a Kremlin aide has said. Yuri Ushakov said in a TV interview that Russia did not need any steps that imitate peaceful actions in this situation, adding that any truce must account for Moscow's interests. I've stated our position that this is nothing other than a temporary respite for the Ukrainian military, nothing more. So that is what Ushakov is being reported by the Western media to have said, and it is fully in line with the Russian position. The Russians have repeatedly said that they're not prepared to accept temporary ceasefires, that the only effect of a temporary ceasefire would be to grant the Ukrainian military, which is currently on the run, a respite, an opportunity to rearm and reorganize and re-equip and reinforce. It would put Ukraine in a better military position and Russia in a worse military position, and therefore Russia has no interest in a temporary ceasefire. This has been the repeated position of the Russians, of Putin himself. He reiterated it just a few weeks ago, I believe in January. Lavrov has spoken about it many times since then. Ushakov works closely with Putin. He is Putin's most senior foreign policy aide, and I'm assuming that he has spoken with Putin, and what he's saying in this interview, this television interview, is authoritative. But to repeat again, we will only know for sure when Putin and Lavrov themselves have spoken. Now, Putin did make some comments yesterday. They weren't directly connected to the ceasefire, but he did visit Kursk region, where he met with the military command of the Russian forces, who have just successfully repelled the Ukrainians in Kursk region. It was a interesting visit. Putin, most unusually, turned up in military uniform, to be more precise, in khaki dress. It's not something he very often does. In fact, it's not something I've ever seen him do, at least not recently. He has in the past worn military uniform on occasions. This was in the early days of his presidency. But since then, mostly he always wears civilian dress, including when he interacts with the soldiers. But on this occasion, he did wear khaki dress. That might reflect the fact that this meeting took place close to the front lines. I'm not in a position to speak about that. But anyway, the overall impression was a rather martial one. And, well, there was a discussion between Putin and the military chiefs. He heard, according to the Kremlin website, a long report from the chief of the general staff, General Valery Gerasimov, the man who is in overall charge of the forces fighting in the special military operation. I am sure that this report was very, very carefully prepared in advance, and that its text was probably agreed with the Kremlin, just saying. But anyway, Putin heard about this report. The report was interesting and revealed an awful lot of interesting facts about the fighting in Kursk, which I will come to shortly. And Putin responded to Gerasimov's words by basically commending the success of the Russian forces in Kursk, giving instructions for the remainder of Kursk to be liberated from the Ukrainians now that the Ukrainians have been expelled from the town of Sudzha. And importantly, Putin also instructed Gerasimov to consider the possibility of creating a buffer zone in Sumy region to protect Kursk region from further incursions. Now, the last, I think, is significant because it implies that the Russian forces are indeed preparing to advance into Sumy region in Ukraine, perhaps not occupy the city of Sumy itself, but to establish another protective zone around Sumy region, very similar to the one that Group of Forces North has established in Kharkiv region, on the border between Kharkiv region and Belgorod region inside Russia. And that, of course, would require a further military operation. And that doesn't seem to be consistent with a ceasefire. It rather suggests that Putin does not anticipate a ceasefire anytime soon. So if you take these words of Putin's yesterday together with these words of Ushakov's today, it looks as if the Russians are going to reject the 30-day ceasefire proposal that Witkoff is coming with and that the Americans announced on Tuesday. And, well, I've discussed this many times. It is fully consistent with what the Russians have been saying. I would be very surprised if it were otherwise. However, as I also discussed at great length in my program yesterday, the Russians are probably not going to leave things there. They're going to tell Witkoff, look, we cannot accept this 30-day ceasefire proposal that you are making. It doesn't make sense for us to do so. We don't trust the Ukrainians. We absolutely do not trust Vladimir Zelensky. He's already going around talking about the fact that he is never going to cede to Russia or recognize Russia's control of any millimeter of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Given that he's talking in that way, he's not talking like a man who wants to make peace. He is still talking like a man who intends to continue the conflict and to continue the war. At the very least, given this rhetoric from Zelensky, if we were to agree a ceasefire now, well, that would mean that we'd find ourselves again in that impossible situation that we found ourselves in with the Minsk agreement, in which we have agreed to a ceasefire along the existing conflict lines. It's intended to be a temporary ceasefire. It's intended to lead to a political settlement, but the Ukrainians will do exactly what they did after the Minsk agreement. They will dig in. They will refuse to comply with any of the political provisions. They will insist instead on prolonging and extending the discussions indefinitely, and their European friends will assist them in doing so. We will therefore end up in exactly the same situation that we ended up after the Minsk agreement, with a frozen conflict. It's just that the front line will have been moved significantly further to the west, but we will not have a full and complete resolution of this conflict, which is what we want to see. So I suspect this is what the Russians are going to say to Witkoff, and it is what Putin is going to say to Trump when and if he speaks to Trump, possibly today. Anyway, that's one thing the Russians will say. But the Russians will also say to the Americans this: we do, however, want a final settlement of this conflict in Ukraine. We have said that many, many times. We do want to resolve the situation, but in a way that recognizes our legitimate security interests. We cannot accept an unconditional ceasefire, such as the one that is being offered, a ceasefire which, with the assistance of their European friends, bear in mind that Olaf Scholz, on behalf of Germany, is already saying that Germany will continue to arm Ukraine throughout the period of the ceasefire, even if the United States were to cease to do so. Anyway, Russia cannot accept an unconditional ceasefire, but it is absolutely prepared to move forward and to negotiate peace. And the way that can be done is Russia can take reciprocal steps, the kind of reciprocal steps that Rubio was talking about, but these are not reciprocal steps that involve acceptance of this unacceptable ceasefire proposal. Rather, and instead, Russia will set up its own negotiating team to meet with the negotiating teams from the United States and Ukraine. There can be agreement as to where that will happen. It could be Riyadh or Jeddah or Doha or Abu Dhabi or someplace like that, or Ankara or Istanbul. The exact venue doesn't matter, except most likely it will be in the Middle East. We can agree to that step. We can also discuss a ceasefire, though not an unconditional ceasefire. A ceasefire which we are confident will this time actually work. And that means a ceasefire in which the Ukrainians do take steps to withdraw their troops, not just from the contact line, but probably from the entirety of the four regions. There might be a qualifier about that, which I will come to. But anyway, that the Ukrainians can withdraw from the four regions. And at the same time, we can arrange mechanisms to ensure that this is done. Rubio yesterday spoke about using satellite surveillance to enforce and monitor the ceasefire. But of course, this is not probably going to be acceptable to the Russians either, because if we're talking about satellite systems, surveillance systems possessed by the Americans and the Russians, well, we've seen in the past that the Americans may be saying one thing based on what their satellites are supposedly saying, and the Russians may be saying something completely different depending on what their satellites are supposed to be saying. And relying purely on satellites is simply going to create another cause of contention between the great powers, and that won't work. Someone is going to have to go in, somebody who is really generally impartial and objective is going to have to go in and see that the ceasefire, the terms of the ceasefire that the Russians are going to insist on are really implemented this time. Obviously, it cannot be the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE was supposed to monitor the ceasefire that was agreed at the time of the Minsk agreement. It's now absolutely clear, I don't think this is even controversial anymore, that the OSCE, on the contrary, worked continuously on Ukraine's behalf and was providing targeting data about militia units, which enabled the Ukrainian military to conduct artillery strikes against them. During the period of the ceasefire, the OSCE was supposed to be monitoring. The extent of Russia's total loss of faith in the OSCE is one of the understated stories of this conflict. The Russians at one time, as I remember, had even thought that the OSCE might eventually come to be the keystone of a new security architecture in Europe. The Russians no longer think that now, and it is because of the failure of the OSCE that the Russians are now talking no longer about European security, a rethinking of Europe's security architecture, but are talking about rethinking the security architecture of, as they like to say, Western Eurasia. In other words, the continent is not Europe, it is Eurasia. Europe is merely a region within that wider Eurasian continent, and therefore that opens the way for countries who are also part of the Eurasian continent, India and China, for example, also to be involved in settling this conflict in Ukraine. Just saying. But anyway, someone will have to enforce the ceasefire, monitor the ceasefire. It can't just be the Americans. It certainly can't be the OSCE. Maybe it will have to be people from China and India. Maybe they won't be peacekeepers. In fact, my impression, increasingly, is that the Russians are coming down strongly against the idea of any kind of peacekeeping force from any party in Ukraine at all. That has been their consistent position, and it looks to me as if it is going to be their position still. Certainly, just as they won't accept the OSCE, they won't accept European peacekeepers from Britain and France. And as I discussed yesterday, the fact that the joint statement that the Americans and the Ukrainians have published make no reference to such European peacekeepers suggests to me that the Americans also are increasingly cool on that idea, as they should be. So anyway, it could be that there might be a ceasefire, but it will be very much a ceasefire, or the Russians will say very much a ceasefire, based on what Putin proposed back in June of last year when he addressed the foreign ministry. Now, saying that the Russians expect the Ukrainians to withdraw completely from all the 4 regions is controversial with lots of people. I read articles, and I'll come to one in particular, well, 2 articles in fact, by him, by Anatol Lieven, who reject the idea outright, but who nonetheless insist that the Russians must accept this ceasefire. They say that this is an absurd proposal. I don't think the Russians see it as an absurd proposal, just saying. There might be some points, however, where there might be possible degrees of flexibility. One area, for example, might be the city of Zaporozhye, which is far and away the biggest place, still outside Russian control in Zaporozhye region. Zaporozhye is a major industrial center. It plays a significant role in Ukraine's economy. It may be that even though the Russians will probably require and insist on a withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, those big cities and towns, perhaps Kherson region west of the Dnieper. The Russians, after all, did occupy Kherson city for some time, and they would probably want to return. It could be that the Russians, recognizing the size and importance of Zaporozhye, are prepared to agree to a phased withdrawal of the Ukrainians from Zaporozhye, and that might be subject to some future discussion. I want to stress this is not something that I know. I'm not anticipating or predicting any Russian steps in that regard. I am not, by the way, in contact with any Russian official who has proposed or suggested or hinted at any such thing, and I have not seen anything like that mentioned anywhere in the Russian media. It's just an idea that I'm floating, but I can imagine as a mechanism, a means to get this process going, that the Russians, without giving up any claim to Zaporozhye, might say that the initial Ukrainian withdrawal from the 4 regions might be more limited in relation to Zaporozhye, and for example, that the Russian military might not enter Zaporozhye, even if some kind of joint civilian control or something like that is established there. Just saying. Anyway, the Russians might insist on that, and of course, the Russians will also want some categorical commitment from the United States that Ukraine will not be joining NATO. Now, this is actually more problematic than is widely understood. Donald Trump is the President of the United States. He cannot, however, bind his successors. There's every possibility that a future Democrat president or even Republican president might reverse whatever commitment about NATO that Donald Trump makes. Getting a decision excluding Ukraine from entering NATO, a treaty excluding Ukraine from entering NATO through the Senate in Washington, is an impossible fantasy. Having the NATO Council confirm that NATO is not looking to expand into Ukraine and reversing the decision that was made in 2008 Well, that would be a step forward, but again, it could be easily reversed, and it would probably run into some opposition. Keir Starmer, just a few weeks ago, signed a treaty with the Ukrainians, which spoke about Ukraine being on an irreversible path towards NATO. He has spoken about this several times. It's difficult to see the British supporting such a proposal at the level of the NATO Council. Other countries, the Baltic states, Poland, for example, might object too, so might the Scandinavians. Even if those countries abstain, the very fact of their abstention would be seen by Moscow as a sign of their continued disagreement, and it would imply that there would be a reversal at some point in the future, or could be a reversal at some point in the future. Nonetheless, in order perhaps to get a ceasefire and to get negotiations moving in some ways, provided there was the Ukrainian withdrawal that I've just been speaking about, provided there was an actual and proper monitoring mechanism created, then the Russians might accept Trump's assurances, especially if these were confirmed by a resolution of the UN Security Council. But, to repeat again, it's unlikely that they would be satisfied with that long term, and I suspect that the Russians will again qualify any acceptance of a ceasefire on that basis, pending commitments from the United States, but also from Ukraine itself. And here I think the Russians will insist on fundamental changes within Ukraine, certainly a new government, certainly Zelensky quitting the scene, perhaps a major restructuring of Ukrainian society and of its constitution. I spoke yesterday in my program of how the Russians said, of how Lavrov, to be more precise, said during his long interview with the American bloggers, how he discussed at length again the question of federalization. I noticed also that over the course of that discussion, he mentioned Odessa many times. Putin has also recently taken to doing so. It could be that what the Russians are looking at is a much more decentralized Ukraine, a federalized Ukraine, than the one we have today, one in which Russian-speaking regions like Odessa and Nikolaev are granted significant autonomous powers, are in a position to make their own arrangements with Moscow, and things of that kind. Now, a lot of this, I suspect the Russians would say, could be sorted out over the course of negotiations between themselves and Ukraine, but negotiations with the United States also. And as I said yesterday, it is an interesting fact that the Jeddah statement published by the Americans and the Ukrainians speaks of the Americans also forming their own negotiating team. So it does look as if, alongside the negotiation between the Ukrainians and the Russians to end the conflict, there will be at least a parallel track, or maybe a simultaneous track, of negotiations between the Americans and the Ukraine and the Russians as well. And it could be that, as I said, this process of federalization could be agreed with the Americans in that sort of way. Lavrov also, over the course of his meeting with the American bloggers, spoke about how he had discussions with the Americans about this, with Secretary of State Kelly, as I very well remember. Some of those discussions took place in London, and I was actually in the vicinity of the discussions, which were taking place, as I remember, in Regent's Park, in the American ambassador's residence in Regent's Park. And I remember watching the security guards and the helicopters flying overhead as these two foreign ministers were speaking to each other. So it could be that the fact that Lavrov touched on the fact that this had previously been just talked about by the Americans and the Russians directly, that might be a signal to the Americans that the Russians would want to discuss all of this with the Americans as well. So all of this is very, very speculative on my part. I don't know what the Russian hand is going to be. But to repeat again, though I am confident that Ushakov is outlining the Russian position on this 30-day ceasefire proposal that came out of Jeddah, the Jeddah talks. In other words, that the Russians are going to reject it. The Russians will want this process to continue. They won't want to slam the door. They will want the process to continue, and they will want to push the discussion further forward. They will say to the Americans, yes, we are interested in a ceasefire. It might not be so complicated to agree as you think, given that you appear to have the Ukrainians where you want them, and given that our demands are not unreasonable, and that a ceasefire could then lead the way to negotiations for a final settlement of the conflict. With the Russians, however, I expect putting a terminal date on them. They probably won't want indefinite negotiations leading nowhere, like the negotiations that took place over the Minsk agreement. So, all very speculative, and as I said, it shouldn't be taken too far. Now, these speculations shouldn't be taken too far. I'm just floating these thoughts, and we will see. Now, as I said in my program yesterday, Witkoff is not the only visitor who is arriving in Moscow today. Another visitor is the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, Russia's strongest ally. There's going to be detailed talks between Lukashenko and Putin. They have an awful lot to discuss: military matters, security issues, economics. Russia and Belarus seem to be moving forward towards full integration of their economies and military systems. And for the record, I think sooner or later, eventually, this will probably lead to some kind of political union as well. But I accept that is for the future. Anyway, Lukashenko is coming to Moscow with all of that. It is his first foreign visit since his recent re-election, incidentally. The key thing to say is that usually after Putin and Lukashenko meet, there is a press conference. A press conference at which Putin and Lukashenko take questions from the media, mostly, I suspect, in this case, the Russian and Belarus media. And it is highly likely, it is very, very probable indeed. In fact, I would say that it is almost a certainty that over the course of that press conference, Putin will comment on the ceasefire proposal that the Americans are providing to him. And, well, we will then have that definitive, authoritative statement of the Russian position, which I suspect Ushakov is basically preparing us for. And notice, going back to Ushakov, that though he is rejecting, in effect, the current ceasefire proposal, he is not rejecting a ceasefire outright. He says that the Russians will not accept any steps that imitate peaceful actions in this situation, which is a way of scorning this ceasefire proposal. But he's not saying that they won't accept a ceasefire entirely. He's saying that any truce must account for Moscow's interests. And one way or the other, I expect that the Russians will explain all of this to the Americans and putting it to them, and we may get some further light on this when Putin makes his statements in his press conference, as I expect he will today. So it's going to be a very busy day for Putin. Whether he meets with Wyckoff remains to be seen. I would not be surprised, given that the Lukashenko meeting is likely to be very prolonged and involve lots of business, that Putin postpones any meeting with Wyckoff and any conversation with Trump until tomorrow, though Putin is one of those few people who don't seem to keep diplomatic balls up in the air, more than one up in the air at the same time. And he has on occasion spoken to world leaders, one after the other. It could be that he will take a call from Trump, and he might meet with Wyckoff and presumably work through the night, as he often does, and still be there tomorrow morning. But anyway, I'm not going to predict Putin's moves. I don't keep his diary, so I don't know what he's going to do. But certainly I expect that after the press conference, which, as I said, I am assuming will happen today, we will get some more clarity about what the Russian position is going to be. Now, there are some people who, well, there's a sort of difference of opinion about this as to what Russia's interests might be. There is a widespread view, which you can find well represented across the media, and which you also find in some sections of the Russian media, though not so much there, I should say, that all negotiations are a complete waste of time, that Russia shouldn't waste time with negotiations. It should simply send Wyckoff packing, tell Trump that this proposal, this 30-day truce proposal, is unacceptable, tell the Americans to go away, maybe come back with something better, but that Russia really isn't interested in negotiations, doesn't need to negotiate, and just focus exclusively on the special military operation and on winning the war. Now, there is, as I said, a fairly widespread view about that, but it is important to say at this point that that is never the position that the Russian government has taken at any time in this conflict. They've never said that that is the approach that they intend to take. They've always said that they are prepared to engage both the Ukrainians and the West in discussions, and they've also always said that though if they have to, they will secure their legitimate security interests, which Lavrov made clear means the protection of their people. They are prepared to do that by force, but if they can achieve it through diplomacy and negotiation, obviously, they would prefer that. Now, I think that there is an enormous amount of confusion and muddle about this. And, well, looking at this from the other side, one encounters other people who say that it's absolutely in Russia's interests to end this war now. They have to end it now, and that they should simply agree to the ceasefire, or at least a ceasefire on very similar terms to the ones that have been outlined, because that's their way of, in effect, being readmitted into world affairs on an equal basis with the West. And, well, you come across articles to that effect as well. There's an interesting article which I think expresses this view quite well. It's from Anatol Lieven, and it can be found in Responsible Statecraft. It says this: in the view of a member of the Russian elite, previously close to Putin, with whom I spoke last June, whilst Putin is a pragmatist who is willing to compromise if that is the best option, if Ukraine were to collapse militarily, then within Putin's mind, Peter and Catherine are still waiting, a reference to the two Russian monarchs who conquered most of Ukraine from the Turks and Poles in the 17th and 18th century. Not true about Peter, by the way, but let's skip that. The risk then of Trump's suspension of aid to Ukraine, this is before it was reinstated, is that it will embolden Russian hardliners, including the hardline side of Putin, to reject compromise and hold out for a greater victory. This would be a dreadful mistake, for Moscow now has within sight the possibility of something that it has been seeking in vain for more than 3 decades under Gorbachev, Yeltsin and Putin, a great and lasting agreement with the United States that will end Washington's efforts to exclude Russia from consultation on European security issues and destroy its status as a great power. It would be an act of historic folly on Moscow's part to throw this away for the sake of capturing some ruined cities in eastern Ukraine inhabited by bitterly resentful people. I do not think, I cannot believe that there is a single official in Moscow, in the foreign ministry, in the defense ministry, in the intelligence community, in the Kremlin, who is coming up to Putin and telling him, we've got to sign this agreement because we now have within that our grasp, if we do, the possibility of a great and lasting agreement with the United States that will end Washington's attempts to exclude us from consultations on European security and destroy our status as a great power. I think anybody who were to come with that to Putin would not be taken seriously. I think that the Russians look at the military and strategic situation in Europe in extremely practical terms, and they have no faith at all that if they sign any kind of ceasefire agreement, they will get this great and lasting agreement with the United States that Anatol Lieven is talking about. They've been here too many times to believe that anymore. They will want absolute, as they said many times, concrete assurances that this time it's for real. And if that means that they're not getting those assurances, they will not agree to any kind of cessation of hostilities or anything like that. So, just to say, to understand the Russian position, always I think it's important to look at this from the perspective of Russian security interests. These are paramount, And these are what the Russians are always ultimately thinking about, what is at the front of their minds. These are not grandiose plans about Russia being accepted by the United States again as a great power. Great powers are great powers, by the way. They are great powers because that is what they are, not because other countries accept them as such. Just saying. Grandiose plans about Russia finding its place in Europe again and things like that. What the Russians are concerned about, this is what they've spoken about many times, it's what Putin has talked about many times, is the security of their western borders and of the people, any people they have who lie beyond those borders. Russians who still live in whatever parts of Ukraine will not become part of Russia as a result of whatever negotiating process follows. And from a Russian perspective, and I've discussed this many times before, in order to achieve that security on Russia's western borders, the Russians need some kind of agreement, some kind of understanding with the United States. The alternative is that the Russians are forced to stay permanently on their guard, keep armies of 1 million men on their western borders, and of course that is a drain on Russian society and on the Russian economy, and it isn't ultimately what the Russians would prefer to do. The Americans, or so it seems to me, have a similar imperative: to avoid an open-ended confrontation with the Russians of that kind. President Trump appears to be in the process of carrying out a massive reorganization of the way in which the US economy works. In some ways, his plans look as grandiose as those of the Soviet reformers of the late 1980s. And they're based on the same premise that the current economic model that the United States has been working with is simply not sustainable in the long term. The United States cannot rely exclusively on its financial system to generate wealth, that it needs some kind of manufacturing and industrial capacity to remain a great power, that it needs that in order to provide the essential glue to American society, which the financialization of the United States has weakened. And in addition, the United States, in order to build up its industrial capacity again, it needs to reconsider the position of the dollar in the long term, whether it really is useful for the United States to keep the dollar operating in the way that it has done over the last 50, 80 years, and whether free trade, such as has been practiced, not with all the world, but with a large part of it, makes any sense for the United States any longer today. Now, that is a massive reorganization of American society. It is a reorganization, to repeat again, which is intended to preserve America's position as a great power, not to do away with it. It is also a reorganization intended to put the United States in a stronger position to confront China in the Asia-Pacific region, if that is where the United States is heading towards. And for the same reason as the Russians, that means a stabilization in some form of the situation in Europe, so that the United States does not have to divert resources to try to contain Russia in Europe as it has previously done. So that provides, as between the Russians and the Americans, some reason to come to some kind of understanding with each other. The Russians, in order to obtain the security on their western border, which will enable them finally to focus single-mindedly on building up their economy and their society so that they can do that in peace. The Americans, to stabilize the situation in Europe so that they can complete this giant program of reorganization of the United States that the Trump people have launched, and at the same time put themselves in a position to stand up to China in the Far East. So one can see that both of these two great powers have a good reason to talk to each other and to come to some sort of understanding over Ukraine. But that doesn't mean, and this is where I come back for the last and final time to this question of the 30-day truce, that the Russians are going to make concessions which they don't feel they need to, and which would put them in a worse position than the one they are in now. They've had many experiences in the past of Russia making concessions to the Western powers, only for the Western powers to pocket those concessions and to come back for more. And the Russians are not going to do this again. Now, no less a person than the Belarusian President Lukashenko, who speaks in a very forthright way, more forthright than the Russians themselves often do. He's made this very same point after his arrival in Moscow this morning. I'm taking this from TASS. TASS reports him as saying that Washington will not be able to turn the proposal for a truce in Ukraine into a ploy to entrap Moscow. Lukashenko then added that based on all past deceptions, time has come to use your head. No, they won't catch us anymore, and Russia even more so. He said this, all the time there are tricks, they either deceive or something else. Well, it's time for us to use our heads. So the Russians are not going to make concessions about a truce which could leave them in a worse position than the one they are in. Certainly they won't do that in advance of what are likely to be difficult and complex negotiations. It makes no sense for them to do that. But the fact that they are likely to reject this truce, and that is absolutely my expectation, doesn't mean that they still don't want to find some way forward to compromise, or at least to negotiate a satisfactory outcome which takes into account their security concerns with the United States. Anyway, we will see where all this goes. Even as I've been making this program, information is flashing up. I've just seen a report that Ushakov, after giving that interview on Russian television, has now confirmed that Putin will be meeting American representatives, presumably that means Wyckoff, over the course of today, and that he will be clarifying Russia's position in relation to the ceasefire. So we should have a much clearer picture of where the Russians stand by the end of today. Well, in the meantime, even as all this is going on, the war, of course, continues. And it's important to remember that Putin didn't just go to Kursk region to make, to hand out decorations and to tell people about how, well they've all done. He went there because this has been clearly the area which the Russian military has given most priority to over the last few weeks, and where Russia has won the single biggest battlefield victory that it has achieved so far over the course of the special military operation. Now, I say that, you will find others who will take a different view. General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian military chief, he has been talking again. And of course, he has his own take on how things have turned out. He says that units of the defense forces, if needed, can make a maneuver in order to move to more advantageous positions. First of all, this applies to the unmanned component and artillery fire assets. I gave all the necessary orders to this effect. And he apparently has also said that the fighting operations are taking place in the suburbs of Suja and the surrounding areas. Notice that he's referring to the suburbs of Suja and the surrounding areas. He's in effect, in other words, admitting that Suja itself, the center of the town, has now passed fully under Russian control, that the Ukrainians are no longer there. Now, there have been many criticisms of General Syrskyi, and maybe the criticisms of him as a battlefield commander are justified, but no one, it seems to me, would doubt the ingenuity, his ingenuity in the use of language. Units of the defense forces, if needed, can make a maneuver in order to move to more advantageous positions. This is how General Syrskyi describes a chaotic and disastrous retreat, just to say. But anyway, that's General Syrskyi. Of course, others have been saying other things. Group of Forces North has also provided its, in my opinion, I have to say this, far more factual and interesting account of the nature of the battle over the last couple of hours. And, well, this time I proposed to read it out in full. It says this: on 12th March, Group of Forces North continued to carry out tasks to liberate the Kursk region. During the course of fierce battles, we liberated the regional center, the city of Suja, as well as the village of Podol and the settlement of Melovoy. During the night, fierce fighting continued in the southern sector of the front, as well as in Zaoloshenka and Goncharovka. Contrary to publications of individual war correspondents, we are confronting not only territorial defense units, in other words, second-line Ukrainian units, but also by the remnants of the elite 80th, 82nd and 95th Airborne Assault Brigades. The 92nd Assault Brigade, an army corps, was planned to be created on its basis, and the IDAR Brigade, and the suicide bombers, I don't know what that means, from the 225th Assault Regiment, as well as soldiers of the 61st Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The flight of individual units of the Ukrainian Armed Forces continues to be chaotic. Ukrainian Armed Force soldiers are in vehicles and on foot, are trying to flee in a disorganized manner in the direction of Yunakovka, that is the village in Sumy region. However, all road directions are under our fire control. Ukrainian military PR people publish videos of their escape from the Suja border area, but these are basically old videos, as is clearly demonstrated by the still lying snow, which has already melted in Kursk region. The fighting also continues in forested areas that are mined by Ukrainian armed forces. Our soldiers note that most of the Ukrainian armed minefields were aimed at preventing escape of their own people. In the liberated territories, our military personnel, together with the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations, organised the evacuation of the civilian population who have experienced all the horrors of occupation. And then they go on to say this, they comment about recent changes in the Ukrainian High Command. General Syrskyi, after telling us about how the units of the defense forces, if needed, can maneuver in order to move to more advantageous positions, has then gone along and sacked the commanding general in this area, the Ukrainian commanding general, the general who was responsible for the defense of the Ukrainian forces in Sudzha, who is Major General Krasilnikov. And this is what Group of Forces North has to say about that. For the failure of the Kursk adventure, the Kiev regime has already found a scapegoat. It was the commander of the group, the northern military grouping, Major General Krasilnikov, whose position has now been taken by a paratroop officer, General Shandar. There is a high probability that it is precisely due to the airborne assault brigades that have lost their combat capability that the enemy will try to prevent our advance already in the Sumy direction. The total advance of our troops in Kursk region was over 4.5 kilometers, and 32 units of enemy armored vehicles have been destroyed. So that is what Group of Forces North is telling us. It is not an organized withdrawal. It is not a withdrawal carried out by shielded, protected by ill-equipped, poorly armed, undisciplined territorial forces of the Ukrainian army. It is a disorganized withdrawal in which 3 paratroop brigades, elite units of the Ukrainian army, together with other elite units, are all caught up, and they are fleeing from Sudzha, from Kursk, with the Russians in hot pursuit, and it is disorganized and chaotic, and it is an escape along roads over which the Russian army has fire control, with the result that devastating losses are being inflicted on the Ukrainians. And not only that, but the very fact that Syrskyi, I presume it is Syrskyi, though no doubt Zelensky has also been consulted, that Syrskyi has taken upon himself to sack the Ukrainian commanding officer in the area, General Krasilnikov. That, to my mind, confirms that Group of Forces North are telling it to us as it is. This was no orderly or planned withdrawal. This is a rout, and the general responsible has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been sacked. Now, I say the general responsible, but there is apparently controversy about this in Ukraine itself. Inevitably, people are now saying that the fault really wasn't General Krasilnikov's at all. He was asked to do impossible things. It had already become obvious for some time that the Ukrainian force in Kursk region could not hold out for very long. It was Syrskyi's job to arrange the defenses properly. It was Syrskyi's job to withdraw the Ukrainian troops from Kursk properly, and that his decision to sack Krasilnikov is a deflection of responsibility, and that Krasilnikov is in reality nothing more than a scapegoat. Now, that is a view that is being widely shared in Ukraine. No less a person, for example, than Mariana Bezuglaya, the dissident Ukrainian MP, who's often very critical of the Ukrainian military leadership. She apparently shares it. She's been making comments to this effect, and she too is pointing the finger at Syrskyi and is saying that it is his fault. I'm going to finish this program by saying that, in my opinion, this is perhaps also rather hard on Syrskyi himself. There's good reason to think, and I remember discussing this back in August, that Syrskyi was never very enthusiastic about the Kursk operation. He is, after all, a trained military officer. He received his training whilst he was a Soviet army officer in a military school in Russia, just saying, and of course he is an ethnic Russian. He didn't rise to any very senior level in the Soviet military. He was too young to. And from what I can see, the training he has received since then is somewhat patchy. But nonetheless, he is the most senior officer by rank in the Ukrainian armed forces. He's the only Ukrainian general to have the rank of colonel general, and he does have some technical understanding of this. There is no doubt. He knows the technical part of his job, even though maybe he's not the greatest military chief around. And again, I'm being slightly ironic when I say this. But I suspect that he knew enough. He had a sufficient understanding of military reality back in August to understand that this military operation in Kursk was foolhardy, to say the least, and that it really didn't make a huge amount of sense in military terms. So I'm inclined to believe the reports that I remember reading back in August, that he was never especially keen on this idea. Having said that, one shouldn't be too soft on him. Just like his predecessor, General Zaluzhny, Syrskyi, nonetheless, despite whatever doubts he might have had, went along with the orders that the man who is really ultimately responsible for this disaster, who is, of course, the overall commander-in-chief, the president of Ukraine, or at least the person who occupies the position of president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, the orders, the strange, bizarre orders that Zelensky gave. It's clear that there's little doubt about this, that it was Zelensky who initially dreamed up the Kursk operation. Apparently he did so as early as January, February 2024, around the time of the fall of Avdiivka. He seems to have sold it to various other people. It seems that Kirill Budanov was also initially a supporter, and it was Zelensky who ultimately gave the order to Syrskyi to have it done. So the main responsibility for this catastrophe is Zelensky's, at least in Ukraine. But this is a responsibility that is actually widely shared. I don't myself any longer have any doubt that Western officials, the leadership at that time of the United States, the Biden administration, probably the governments of Britain and France, were also in on this plan and encouraged Ukraine to do it, with the catastrophic consequences that we now see. So, though Krasilnikov might indeed be a scapegoat, and Syrski perhaps is not the person who is ultimately to blame. We can see that at a political level, responsibility is widely shared. Now, there's been some more information about the overall state of the Ukrainian military. There's been confirmation from Associated Press, or at least there's a report by Associated Press, that Ukraine has run through its entire stockpile of ATACMS missiles. Now, Associated Press speaks about 40 ATACMS missiles that were delivered to Ukraine. My understanding is that can only refer to the final batch of ATACMS missiles delivered to Ukraine by the United States sometime in the autumn or perhaps late summer of 2024, in conjunction with the decision to launch missile strikes against Russia. The American media previously has spoken of as many as 500 ATACMS missiles having been delivered by the United States to Ukraine. Though I do remember that when there was reports of this delivery, or at least of the number of ATACMS missiles that Ukraine had left to launch its strikes against Russia back in the autumn, there were already reports then that they numbered no more than 50, which is consistent in some respects with the Associated Press story. And Ukraine ran through its entire stockpile of ATACMS missiles, and as a result, it's no longer able to launch ATACMS missiles anywhere on any part of the front lines, not just against Russia, but against Crimea or other places, because for the moment it has no ATACMS missiles left. And the Trump administration, despite the lifting of the pause on military aid, doesn't seem to be in any hurry to supply Ukraine with any more. Now, the Russians are making it very clear that the reality about the ATACMS is not that Ukraine hasn't been able to press home its advantage in terms of using the ATACMS because they've all been expended. It is because the ATACMS was a failure on the battlefield. The Russians were able to shoot the vast majority of ATACMS missiles launched against them, whether in the territory of the special military operation or in pre-2014 Russia. The Russians were able to shoot the great bulk of these missiles down. I've spoken about this many times. This missile was essentially a failure. And our old friend Vladimir Rogov is now telling us about this. He says this: we cannot say that the fact that ATACMS missiles are no longer being used is due to the goodwill of the United States. The absence of ATACMS missiles hitting targets in Russia is due to the excellent performance of our air defenses and Russian strikes on the delivery points of these missiles. In early March, we targeted ships in the port of Odessa carrying a shipment of ATACMS missiles and 2 HIMARS launchers. And he also says that he's not completely convinced that this AP article is necessarily true. He says that strikes using ATACMS missiles actually have taken place after the middle of January. And he says this publication raises many questions. I would consider it a special information operation, as is often the case in the Western press, intended to mislead us. They claim that they ran out of them in January. The claim that they ran out of them in January is false. On March 4th, there was an attempt to launch an ATACMS strike on the Bryansk region. The governor mentioned it, and fragments of this very American missile were found. Now, for once, Rogov is wrong, actually, on the question of the missile fragments that were found by the Russians in Bryansk region. They were found in March, but I read in the Russian media that examination of the missile by the Russians determined that it was probably launched in January, within the time limit set out in the AP article. But anyway, here we have another example of a game-changer missile system that failed completely to change the game. Yesterday in my article I talked about the fact that the F-16s and the Mirage 2000 didn't seem to be achieving very much in Ukraine. We see the collapse in Kursk. If the Trump administration now throws a tantrum and decides to send more military equipment to Ukraine to keep the war going, because the Russians are not accepting a 30-day ceasefire, well, all I would say is that the ATACMS story ought to serve as an example of why doing so is a huge mistake. Whatever American system is sent to Ukraine, the Russians never seem to find a difficulty in developing a counter. And I'm certain that this will happen with any further American systems that are sent to Ukraine from this point on. I doubt, by the way, that the Trump administration has a huge enthusiasm in doing this, in going beyond the deliveries that Biden has already previously authorized. But anyway, if Trump becomes furious because the Russians are not accepting this 30-day ceasefire and decides to flood Ukraine with more weapons, what he will find is that there aren't enough weapons to make a real flood, that the Russians will be able to deal with whatever weapons are provided, and that all that will happen is that American arsenals will be depleted further. Well, this is where I end today's program. I suspect that tomorrow's will be a blockbuster as we get much more news about what the Russians are going to do. As I said, I fully expect a press conference from Putin later today, and we should have clarity from Moscow as to what the Russian position is. But as of the time of making of this program, all the telltale hints point to a rejection of the Jeddah ceasefire proposal. So this is where I finish today's program. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.